Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Catholic Forum. I am Deacon Tim O'Donnell, Executive Director here, and I'm delighted to welcome you, both you who are here in DiGiovanni Hall and on the live stream. Let me begin with a quick word about the Harvard Catholic Forum. Our mission is to share the riches of Catholic thought and culture through lectures, non-credit courses, master classes, reading groups, and other programs, both to the university community and to the wider public. Check out our website at harvardcatholicforum.org, where you can sign up for our program announcements, register for future events, and support our important mission by making financial contributions. All of our programs are free of charge, but not a single one is free to put on, so please help us. We depend on contributions of any size. Tonight's lecture will be archived on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. If you like what you see and hear, please share the link to that channel with others. We always have more views on the archive than we do on day one. Several thank yous are in order. First, to the forum's program director, Shani Agarwal, without whom none of us would be here this evening. And next, our co-sponsors, the Lumen Christi Institute, the Harvard Christian Alumni Society, the Collis Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture at Cornell, the Society of Catholic Scientists, and the Kateri Institute at the University of Michigan. And finally, this event is made possible through the support of the John Templeton Foundation, through its grant in Lumine, promoting the Catholic intellectual tradition at campuses nationwide. So let me give you a roadmap of tonight's event. The lecture segment will last about 45 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity for some Q&A. Those of you who are here in person should have received a note card and pencil when you came in. If you have a question, please write it on the card. And shortly after 6 o'clock, maybe closer to 6:10, some of my colleagues will come up the aisles and collect the cards and bring them to me. If you have a question on your card, if you'd put your hand up, it will be easier for them to collect the cards. Now, I will pass on as many questions as I can, and unfortunately, we are not able to take questions from the live stream audience today. And here's something important. Please help us evaluate and improve our programs by filling out our 2-minute survey after the program today. You who are here should have a paper survey, and you can complete it with the pencil and drop it in one of the baskets by the door as you leave. Zoom participants will get an online version, which again only takes a couple of minutes to click through. Thank you for your help with this. And finally, please stay and join us for a reception right here in DiGiovanni Hall after the lecture. Tonight's lecturer is Peter Harrison, Professor Emeritus of History and Philosophy at the University of Queensland and Professorial Research Fellow at the University of Notre Dame, both in Australia. And previously, he was Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford. He has published extensively in intellectual history, focusing on the philosophical, scientific, and religious thought of the early modern period, and has written more generally on the historical relations between science and religion. His 12 books include The Territories of Science and Religion from 2015, and most recently, Some New World, Myths of Supernatural Belief in a Secular Age by Cambridge University Press in 2024. Please join me in welcoming Peter Harrison.
Well, thanks, Tim, for that welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and thanks for coming along. hello to all those who are on the live stream. As you can see, this evening I'm going to talk about contemporary naturalism and how it relates to the concept of the supernatural. I guess if there's one take-home message that I want you to get tonight, it's essentially this message from the sociologist Emil Durkheim who wrote this classic book, The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. And as you can read there, what he says is the concept of the supernatural is a recent one, and moreover, that when that concept was absent, before it was established in Western thought, the possibility of the miraculous was entirely conceivable. To put it another way, for Durkheim, the idea of the supernatural is a distinctively Western conception. It's one that emerges in the modern period, and prior to its emergence, the very notion of supernatural interventions was conceptually unproblematic. And in essence, the talk this evening is really about unpacking how the supernatural came to have its present meaning and what some of the implications of its coming into existence are. In particular, I'm interested in how this relates to the contemporary attitude that we might refer to as naturalism, and I'll say more about that in a second. So just to give you the structure of the talk, I'm going to start with some dictionary definitions. That sounds a little bit like the high school debate, but you'll see that these definitions actually are really important. I'm then going to say something about when historically the idea of the supernatural emerged in the West and what it first meant and how it came to take on its present meaning as defining a realm that's distinct from the realm of the natural. I'm going to talk about the role of science in establishing this distinction, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how this conception has been involved or implicated in a series of what I call myths of modernity, which is stories about what modern secularity consists in. So let me move to the first thing, this question of our definitions. And here's a very standard dictionary definition of religion: belief in or acknowledgement of some supernatural power or powers. Now, the three main concepts involved in this definition, I would argue, each have their own distinctive histories. Religion is also a modern conception. Belief as an epistemic category is also a modern conception. We don't have time to deal with those, so I'm going to focus mostly on this notion of the supernatural. But there's a sense in which the birth of a conception of the supernatural is also part of how, as modern subjects, we think about both religion and religious belief itself. So, here's the thing. If the conception of the supernatural arrives late, as Durkheim puts it, what this means is that most of those individuals who we conceptualise as having religious lives, which is to say medieval Christians, pre-Christian religions, traditional religious societies, all of these exist without a conception that, according to this definition, is actually central to how they should be conceiving of the world. Okay? So there's something very interesting going on here. It's as if the Inuit people had no word for ice and snow, and yet this is supposed to be something that's ubiquitous. Okay? So something very interesting going on here. If most of the subjects that we regard as being committed to something like religion are missing a conception that, according to this definition, is essential to what it is to be religious. So we're going to explore that a little bit. Second definition for you, naturalism. And naturalism in philosophical discussions has a variety of meanings. For the purpose of the exercise this evening, it's a very simple definition. That is to say, a belief that there are only natural things and that there aren't supernatural or spiritual forces or powers. Now here, in the case of modern naturalism, we have a significant difference with the case of religion. because the distinction between the natural and the supernatural is key for those who profess naturalism. And here there is an asymmetry. Historically, this distinction has not been important for people who professed religious convictions, but it is vitally important for this position, which is to say contemporary naturalism. And I want to say a little bit more about how naturalism in this dictionary definition sense is manifested. So let me take, for an example, this best-selling book by Sean Carroll, who's a well-known populariser of science and indeed a distinguished cosmologist himself, and presently at Johns Hopkins University. This is, as the title down the bottom suggests, a best-selling book. Look it up on Amazon. It's got terrific reviews. But in this book, Carroll gives us what I think is an example of what naturalism looks like in the wild as it's associated with a scientific approach to the natural world. And in essence, he's simply exemplifying the dictionary definition that I gave you before. So there's only a natural world, it's got laws of nature, there's no separate realm of the supernatural, okay? There's no cosmic teleology, there's no purpose. Pretty straightforward. Let's just give you a look at a few more exemplifications of modern naturalism. So David Papineau, an analytic philosopher at King's College London, in this definition of naturalism in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a terrific resource for philosophy. Here he tells us that the great majority of modern philosophers consider themselves to be naturalism. In what sense are they naturalists? They reject the existence of supernatural entities. Okay? So the standard position for philosophy, Papineau tells us, is a commitment to naturalism in the senses that we've talked about. That is to say, rejection of the supernatural. This then goes well beyond philosophy, however. Don't strain your eyes and attempt to read this table. The take-home message is below. If I could pull the screen down, you'd get the second line, but I'll read it out for you. Basically, everyone in the academy operates on at least the methodological assumption of naturalism, right? Basically, that's the message here. Not only that, going beyond this methodological commitment, in fact, most academics, by a significant margin, are less likely to believe in the supernatural than the general population. Okay. Now, here I'm making an important distinction. There is a naturalistic approach to things that is purely methodological and says, for the purpose of this academic exercise, we're going to exclude reference to the supernatural. Okay. That's one thing. And there's a further step that says, actually, in reality, there are no supernatural entities and beings. And that's the position we see exemplified in Sean Carroll. That's the position we see exemplified in David Papineau's characterisation of most modern philosophers. And I'm not going to be overly concerned with the distinction between methodological and metaphysical naturalism for this purposes of the exercise tonight, but I will say that for both methodological naturalism and ontological naturalism, they both rest on an assumption that you can make a coherent distinction between the realms of the natural and the supernatural. It's interesting sociologically, well, it's interesting to me, that the figures in the academic world about commitment to the supernatural, in the stats here, which come from the Rice sociologist Elaine Eklund, who's done a lot of interesting sociological work about religious commitment amongst scientists, suggests that the prevalence of commitment to naturalism is pretty universally spread across the academic disciplines. There's some sociological evidence from the UK that suggests that the prevalence of naturalism is higher in the humanities and higher still in the social scientists. So who are the biggest naturalists in terms of their personal commitments? It's the psychologists and anthropologists, okay? it's certainly not the physicists and mathematicians who are kind of at the other end of the spectrum. Now, as I say, the data from the Rice survey is not clear about that, but that's the interesting trend. I think it's interesting anyway that you see in the UK. So, okay, so we now have an idea of what naturalism entails and how it's manifested, and how, in a sense, it's universal in the academy as both an approach to how we study things and, to some extent, also as a personal commitment. All right, how did we get to this situation where we have this capacity to make this conceptual distinction? Let me first of all just rehearse the anthropological and sociological data. Marshall Salins, who was until 2021 or 22, very distinguished anthropologist at the University of Chicago, published in 2022 posthumously this wonderful book, New Science of the Enchanted Universe. And the basic message of this book is, as he says here, for many cultures of immanence, which is to say pretty much every culture, the so-called supernatural is not distinguished from what we call the natural. So the point I want to make here is that I'm going to focus on the history of this distinction in the West, but Salins is reinforcing the point that was made by Durkheim, that if you look at cultures globally, what you tend not to find is a distinction between the natural and the supernatural, okay? I'm not going to labour that point, I'm not going to establish it, but we can rest there. So something very distinctive is happening in the Western context that we end up with this notion that you can separate the natural from the supernatural. And how do we get that? The person who did the first detective work on this question was Henri de Lubac, who I think is one of the most important Catholic theologians of the 20th century. And his work on the supernatural was controversial for reasons I won't go into. But in very difficult circumstances during the First World War, de Lubac did a lot of detective work, and he wanted to track down the use of the Latin supernaturalis and its variants in the Latin literature. And what de Lubac would have had to do, in essence, was to go through the Patrologia Latina, those volumes there, and see who's using this word, supernaturalis, and its equivalents. It's a mammoth task. He did a fantastic job, and he found no one talked about the supernatural until the 13th century. And in this day and age, we've got this thing called the Patrologia Latina online, and in about 1 minute, I was able to confirm what I suspect it took poor old Henri de Lubac many, many months, perhaps years, to determine, that in fact he was right, that if you punch in supernaturalis asterisk, which is the variance, you find that the frequency of this term is virtually negligible until about the 13th century, when Thomas Aquinas starts to use it. Not in you know, it's not one of his favourite expressions, and crucially for Aquinas, when he uses the word supernatural or supernaturalis, he is not distinguishing between, he's not making a claim about a two-tiered universe where you have a natural level and a kind of superstructure built on top of that. What Aquinas understands the supernatural to be is really, if we think about how he understands natural causation, God is always involved in natural causation, cooperating with natural causes that he has implanted in things, and that's how things operate naturally. But God is involved in that natural operation. But sometimes God acts in ways that either go beyond the natural powers of things or in fact require not the natural powers of things at all. And in those contexts, Aquinas will talk about the supernatural, and often this is about supernatural gifts that individuals might have. Initially, he doesn't use supernatural to describe the miraculous, although later, so certainly in the earlier Summa Theologiae, he doesn't, although he does a bit in some of the later works. We need not be overly worried about that. Now, what most people would say when confronted with this, and certainly what the standard history of Western thought has said, is that, well, this can't be because we have amongst the ancient Greeks examples of naturalism of which our modern versions are kind of later developments. And the standard view in the history of philosophy, for example, and indeed the history of science for a long time, which we'll look at a little bit further in the lecture, was that you see a transition from supernaturalistic explanations to naturalistic explanations already in the pre-Socratic philosophers. That's a standard view of history, and that Christianity changes that, and gradually things get back on track with naturalism, with scientific explanations from the period of the scientific revolution on, that is to say, from the 17th century. Now, I think that view is completely wrong for reasons that I'm about to go into. But given the time constraints, I'm just going to invoke authority on this question. But here we have our panoply of Greek philosophers. The pre-Socratics are represented there. And as I say, the standard view is that the pre-Socratic philosophers, who in standard histories of philosophy are regarded as the progenitors of a philosophical tradition of which contemporary analytic philosophy is the natural descendant, these guys, what made them philosophers as opposed to poets or theologians was their insistence on a naturalistic approach to the world. Okay, and there are some suggestions in Aristotle that might lead you to think that that's a correct interpretation. I don't think it is, and as I say, I'm just going to invoke authority on this one. David Sedley, who I think is one of the leading classicists, wants to say, it tells us straight out that the fact that the world is governed by a divine power is a key part of pre-Socratic thought. In fact, the very reason, their capacity to project rationality on the universe is a function of that very conviction. And so he completely denies this, what I think is a mythical view about the pre-Socratics. And to identify them with naturalism then is a serious misrepresentation of the pre-Socratic agenda. So the histories of philosophy that were invented in the 18th and 19th centuries that start with Thales of Miletus and the pre-Socratics and then end up with typically Immanuel Kant, I think, these are Kantian historians of philosophy, inventing the history of philosophy. That's often the version you will get in Philosophy 101. The classicists tell us, or at least some of them, that that's just a false view of history. Okay, so the point I want to make here is that, I think a standard reaction to saying, well, the word supernatural doesn't appear until the 13th century. You might say, well, actually, but you've got conceptual equivalents. I don't think you do. Okay, I don't think you do, and you won't find them in the pre-Socratics. Where else? We don't find them amongst these guys, either Plato or Aristotle. Plato does make a distinction, as famously, between the sensible and intelligible worlds. That's as close as you get to the natural and supernatural, but it doesn't map onto that. Aristotle has a number of contrasts with the natural and violent, natural and accidental, nature and convention, but he never has a distinction between the natural and the supernatural. And so Martin Heidegger, perhaps not a known authority on the history of philosophy. Some people think his histories are a little bit dubious. He's right on the money on this, though, I think, right? And what he's saying is that for Aristotle, his conception of nature includes all of the gods, right? So notice the gods are not placed in a supernatural basket. Nature is the whole package, and that includes things that are divine. So it's not in the pre-Socratics, this distinction. It's not in Plato and Aristotle. It's certainly not in Stoic thought either. And again, I'm just going to invoke authority here. Cavan-Rowe on the Stoics, nature is virtually synonymous with a set of words that for us is explicitly theological, and it includes this notion of the divine. Okay? So the standard places where we go looking for these distinctions between the natural and the supernatural, or even things that look like the naturalism that people like Papineau and Carroll argue is characteristic of modern science, it's not in the ancient Greeks. Okay? Is it in the New Testament? No. Okay? Look through it, you won't find the word there. So the canonical documents of Christianity make no reference to this distinction either. What is the important distinction? I think the important distinction is between what is created and what is uncreated. Okay, and that doesn't, you might think that's in some ways analogous to natural versus supernatural. I'm not sure that it is. A standard view is often that Christianity, and I'll give you examples of this, as I say, further down the track, that the Greeks are the rational ones, and then Christianity comes along and kills off that rationality, and then that things limp along through the Middle Ages until, Descartes turns the lights back on. That's completely wrong too. I think, in fact, what happens with the advent of Christianity is that for the first time, I think you get the beginnings of a naturalisation. That, ironically or paradoxically, Christianity is itself an agent of naturalisation. And this is part of an ironic pattern that we will see that Protestant Christianity will also, in the 16th and 17th centuries, become an agent of naturalisation as well. And insofar as Christianity influences the emergence of modern science, it is itself also an agent of naturalisation. And why? Because it posits, instead of a world that's filled with deities, right, and instead of having natural events being caused by divine beings, we have a single creator God, okay? And so Hegel, for example, again, not always the most reliable witness historically, but the philosopher Hegel says this in his poetic, perhaps as coherent as Hegel will get, Christianity has emptied Valhalla and felled the sacred groves. It's uprooted the shameful superstitions of the people. So Hegel sees Christianity as a kind of naturalising agent because it reduces the kind of the amount of sacredness that you've got going on in the natural world. And just to give you a specific historical example of this, the church father Lactantius says, so here's one example, the motion of the stars is not voluntary, but of necessity because they obey the laws appointed by God. So the heavenly bodies are not divine. There's one clear instance of how Christianity, by denying the deity of the heavenly bodies and the heavenly realm itself, is a kind of naturalising agent, okay? So the heavenly bodies are not divine agents. Their motive force comes from God. And so this monotheistic view has the capacity to act as a kind of agent of naturalisation. Now, we're doing a very potted history here. We're going from the pre-Socratics and we're now working our way towards the Middle Ages. Apologies for that, but we're going to march quickly through. Our next witness for the prosecution, as it were, is Augustine. And the point here is simply that Augustine, 5th century, is still not working with a conception of a natural-supernatural distinction. Okay, why? Because the daily course of nature is itself intrinsically miraculous. Okay, and why we might talk about things as being miraculous is, for Augustine, because they appear to us as surprising and unusual. But given the way God operates, it's all happening at the same level, right? No distinction between natural and supernatural for Augustine. So if we were to sum it up, where we've got so far, we could say that the 13th century is the first time that we see this distinction, and it's the first time we see it marked in the language of the supernatural. in the 13th century, and I haven't elaborated this in detail, but really this distinction doesn't map onto our present distinction of a two-tiered universe. It doesn't map onto the sorts of definitions that we looked at the outset. It distinguishes rather two kinds of divine activity, right? At the natural level, God works with the order he has implanted in things, okay? At the supernatural level, he works to some extent independently of those created causes. But again, God is involved at natural causation. Here's the clear thing. The natural world is not independent of God's activity on that understanding. Aquinas speaks of supernatural gifts or virtues when he talks about the supernatural. He doesn't talk about supernatural events, doesn't talk about supernatural entities or a supernatural realm for the most part. No one talked about supernaturalism, which we'll come to further down. Interestingly, several scholastic philosophers, including Aquinas' teacher Albert the Great, had their own version of naturalism when they spoke about things in the natural world, and they used a version of methodological naturalism. Again, I don't want to go into that in detail, but it's just to say that you've got this ironic pattern of, to some extent, Christianity's emphasis on a monotheistic deity can act as a kind of naturalising agent. Okay, so we're moving on to the early modern period. And here, let me say that we start to get changes that are going to lay the foundations for modern naturalism, albeit by taking a step in what I think is a very interesting direction. Now, unfortunately, I have to talk about these two guys very briefly, but I'm going to move on then to the science side of the equation. I mentioned that Henri de Lubac was the guy who did the original detective work to find out when people first started to talk explicitly about a distinction between the natural and the supernatural. And de Lubac went on to identify these two individuals, and debates in the context of post-Reformation theological controversies as inventors of a conception of what he calls pure nature. And de Lubac argues that this theological conception helped lay the foundations for a distinction between the natural and the supernatural. Now, the fact is that the details are very complicated, and I have no intention of going into them in any detail. But for those of you who are interested in this, and that might just be me in this room, but anyway, I'm going to tell you very briefly what the discussion was about. It was about how Aquinas was to be interpreted in relation to whether human beings had a single supernatural end or whether they had a natural and a supernatural end. And if none of this makes any sense to you, don't worry about it, because we're going to talk about the scientists who are much clearer, okay? But the point that de Lubac wants to make is that once you have a notion of a natural end and a supernatural end as distinct things, and he doesn't think they're in Aquinas, he thinks these guys read it into Aquinas, you then have the possibility of a natural world that is kind of self-sufficient, and that, he thinks, is what makes something like a modern secular naturalism possible, okay? And if you put that discussion within Catholic theology, if you put that next to a Protestant emphasis on the value of secular vocations and the fact that these things have an importance in their own right, you could argue that in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, you have some of the foundations for what looks like a distinction between natural and supernatural. Okay, now, make of that what you will. I think there's a clearer case to be made, though. In addition to this case, and this is just simply, in a sense, we can say in history, everything is overdetermined, which is to say this distinction between the supernatural and natural is not just one cause. There's a lot of elements going to bring this about. And the other one I want to talk about, which I do think is clearer, we see in early modern science and early modern philosophy. And here we have Descartes, often regarded, again in these potted histories of philosophy, as the the father of modern philosophy, right? And Descartes, the guy who turns philosophy off and turns it back on again. That's his idea of how you reset things after the disaster of the Middle Ages. That's the kind of exaggerated view. But here, what Descartes does in the realm of understanding natural causes in the world, which is key to the foundations of modern science. And in essence, it's Descartes' idea that nature functions according to laws of nature. And this is an innovation, right? This is a conceptual innovation. And how does it work? For Aristotle, and indeed for the medieval scholastics, there were a whole range of different causes: material, formal, efficient, final. We don't need to worry about the details. For Descartes, and from Descartes on, essentially, there's just one kind of cause, and that cause is God. That cause is God, right? End of story. So for Descartes, when something is in motion, what is going on is that God is recreating that object successively in different locations in space, right? Every motion in the universe, for Descartes, is God doing the work. And that's why he says here that God's act of creation of things, right, is the same as his conservation of things, right? So everything that exists and every change that happens is God doing the work, but crucially, he does it according to laws that he has formulated, right? So the very foundation of laws of nature, and this idea of laws of nature is new with Descartes, right, is God, through his will, acting directly on matter. Okay. Now, this doctrine of causation is probably better associated with one of Descartes' disciples, but indeed, it's, to me at any rate, it's explicit in Descartes. But let me give you the example of Malebranche, who is, some of you will know this doctrine is known as occasionalism, but there's no other nature, that is, there are no other natural laws except the efficacious volitions of the Almighty, which is to say, God's will. Nothing going on in the natural world except God directly willing it, and he wills it according to particular laws. Now, this is not just the fancy of Descartes and Malebranche, but becomes foundational to scientific understandings of the operations of the world. So I'm just going to give you in the next couple of slides examples of how we see this idea in key scientific figures in the early modern period, which is to say the 17th, to some extent the 18th century. So Robert Boyle, what are laws of motion? They're not intrinsic to matter, as Aristotle would have said, but they result on, they depend on the will of God directly moving them. Richard Bentley, who is probably unfamiliar to us, but Richard Bentley, in the first of the Boyle lectures, is actually presenting for the first time to a public audience a theological understanding of Newton's Principia, Newton's laws of nature, Newton's essentially the law of gravity. And he is in correspondence with Newton about this, and Newton was very keen for him to give these lectures. And here you can see that what Bentley is saying is that all of the powers of mechanism in the mechanical world are nothing but the immediate finger of God, right? So it's the same point. And I will multiply instances beyond necessity. Isaac Barrow, who was Newton's predecessor in the Lucasian chair at Cambridge, the efficient cause of all things is God, okay? Pretty clear. Moving on to Samuel Clarke, who is Newton's a kind of theological interpreter, as it were, and famously takes up the case of Newtonian science against the German philosopher Leibniz. So there's this famous correspondence between them. But again, Clarke gives you what the Newtonian worldview looks like, understood in this theological context. What is the course of nature? It's nothing else but God acting on matter continually and more. Therefore, absolutely speaking, there's nothing miraculous in the world. If we think everything is directly produced by God, everything is equally natural and miraculous, right? Now, this may seem like an odd development towards a distinction between the natural and supernatural, because we're collapsing everything into the supernatural in a sense. But I just want you to hold that thought, because we'll see why this is a kind of fateful development in terms of the development of modern naturalism. And I'll just give you one more, I think it's just one more. Newton himself, well, there's two things on this slide. So just so that we know that this is the genuine voice of Newton that we hear, the world comes out of nothing but the perfectly free will of God. So although Newton and Descartes disagreed about lots of things, the primacy of the divine will and the operations of nature was one thing that they agreed on. And what this means is for Newton that science itself, or as he calls it, natural philosophy, is intrinsically theological. So when Newton's, you can see the title of Newton's masterwork here, where he lays out the law of gravity, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. So natural philosophy is what we would call science, and what he's saying here in this bottom line is God talk is intrinsic to science, and we know why, because the laws of nature, which are the subject matter of this famous book, probably the most famous scientific book ever, is laws of nature that are divinely authored, right, and depend on God for their ongoing efficacy, right? This theological conception of the laws of nature persisted into the 19th century. Two examples: John Herschel, who is probably the most distinguished scientific polymath of the first half of the 19th century, writes in what is the classic philosophy of science text of the period, his preliminary discourse, that the uniformity of laws of nature, their uniformity arises out of the constancy of the divine will. Okay? And another luminary scientist and historian and philosopher of science of the 19th century, what we see is God as the author of the laws of material nature. So this, in the early part of the 19th century, in England at least, is still the conception of laws of nature that we get. And indeed, the people working on the foundations of thermodynamics at this time, Joule and Lord Kelvin, are also invoking theological conceptions to establish the foundations of thermodynamics. But we won't go into that. So, why is this fateful? Well, let me show you why I think it is. And let's come back to Sean Carroll. And here's Sean Carroll's version of naturalism. And here are the bits that, in a sense, these pious 17th and 18th century theologically literate scientists would agree 100% with Sean Carroll. There is only one world, and it exhibits patterns that we call laws of nature, right? That's what they would agree with. There is no separate realm of the supernatural. They would agree with that as well, right? There is no distinction between, that is to say, the natural things, the things that we take as natural, are all part of the same operation for both Sean Carroll and for these 17th and 18th century scientists. The difference is that we now have a relabeling exercise that says, no, these aren't purely just supernatural. We're just going to take all that and we're going to call it natural. So the birth of modern naturalism takes place with an appropriation of the supernaturalism of the 17th century and just ignoring the theological foundation and relabeling it naturalism. That's how it happens. That's the trick. And let me just give you 5 minutes about how that trick is performed, right? Because it's quite an accomplishment, I think. And it's really to do with the telling of narratives and stories. And I've already introduced you to one of those, which is the story about how the pre-Socratics invented naturalism and that Christianity overturned that. We had the Middle Ages where nothing interesting happened, and then science kicks off in the 17th century, rejecting all that supernatural stuff. And that story gets everything completely wrong, but it's a very powerful story. And it starts with stories about the European Enlightenment. This is a terrific book on the Enlightenment by the Stanford historian Dan Edelstein, who says, the Enlightenment is just a story that modern people tell themselves, and it's important to our identity because we like to think of ourselves as rational people who have got rid of all of those old religious superstitions of the Middle Ages. And there are people who fall for this all the time. One of them just up the road there, Enlightenment Now. So some people buy this story, but proper historians don't, okay? And he's one of them. But we do see this amongst Enlightenment figures themselves. So here, for example, we see the beginnings of this historical myth that Christianity is actually the reason for the decline and decadence of the sciences. And that's just a standard story about history that we see in the French philosophe. We also see it in the foundations of the social sciences themselves. So Auguste Comte, he sort of competes with Durkheim as to who gets to be the progenitor of sociology. But he has an idea that all of our understandings, all of our systems of knowledge pass through three phases, inevitably, right? They start with the theological, they go to the metaphysical, and then they end up with the scientific, right? History doesn't work that way, but this was the sociological conception of history must unfold in a lawful fashion, and here I will tell you what those laws are. And this is repeated in social scientists. We see it in anthropologists like E.B. Tyler. We see it in Fraser's Golden Bough, this notion of societies progressing through stages from the religious and magical to the scientific. And we see it crucially in defenders of Darwinism against imagined religious opponents. So Thomas Henry Huxley is really a key figure in the emergence of a notion of scientific naturalism. And in fact, he is the guy he doesn't actually coin the phrase, but champions this idea that science must be associated with naturalism. And in order to tell that story, he has to rewrite history and projects this myth about there being an enduring struggle throughout history between naturalism and supernaturalism, okay? And this will plug neatly into these first histories of philosophy that talk about the pre-Socratic philosophers as exemplars of this naturalistic approach. And just to give you a bit more from Huxley's mythologising, so theologians lie extinguished around the cradle of all the sciences. So theology and science cannot mix, okay? They are inherently opposed to each other. That's the kind of argument, and that he must project back onto history. Okay. So just a little bit more from Thomas Henry Huxley, who, as I say, is one of the, I've talked about how is the trick done in the 19th century. Huxley is one of the guys who is incredibly persuasive in persuading people that science and naturalism belong together. And although supernaturalism has deep roots, he says, eventually there will be the victory of science because science is opposed to these supernaturalistic understandings. So the natural distinction then, the case I'm making here is a crucial distinction for those who want to promote naturalism, but historically it wasn't important for Christianity. It certainly wasn't important for other cultures. A couple more elements of the myth-making before I wrap up. This then will map onto notions of science-religion conflict, okay? So a conflict between supernaturalism and naturalism is like a conflict between religion and science. And again, it's the 19th century where we see the invention of myths of a conflict between science and religion. And these two guys, John Draper and Andrew Dixon White, are kind of notorious in the history of science as the progenitors of what we call the conflict narrative or the conflict myth. And here we see it's the establishment of Christianity that kills off this naturalistic approach, and it's only when Christianity is suppressed that this rational, enlightened way of understanding the world that we regard as scientific, it's possible for it to emerge. And as you can see from the history that I've set out, this is just completely false in relation to the key figures of the scientific revolution that we've looked at. And then finally, just to see what this looks like in the hands of a professional philosopher, Karl Popper, famous philosopher of science from the last century. There's the myth right there, just laid out in a paragraph. I'll let you read it for yourselves. Okay, so there it is. Gets things completely wrong. Wrapping up then, what can we say? So the idea of the supernatural is foundational to our present understandings of both religion and naturalism. We see it written into those definitions, okay? It's a key part of how we understand them. But this only arose in the West late, as Durkheim said, and it arose only in the West, in essence, okay? And it arose, essentially took on its modern form in the past 2 centuries. Those people who pioneered modern science, from Descartes to Boyle to Newton, they were committed to this new conception of laws of nature, and in that process they supernaturalised the whole of the world. And what that meant was there's only one kind of causation going on, and that fatefully laid the foundations for a hostile takeover later in the 19th century by the naturalists, right? So these pious Newtonian scientists simply had all of their stuff redescribed in purely naturalistic terms. But what the naturalists did was they retained all of the notions of intelligibility and lawfulness that originally had this theological foundation. So when Sean Carroll talks about there are only laws of nature, he has no answer to the question, well, where did those laws of nature come from? Or how do you give an account of those laws of nature, or their force, or their universality, or whatever? Those things originally had a theological foundation. What made it possible for that trick to be performed was that the telling of these false narratives about a progressive history that gradually went from supernaturalism to naturalism. And for these key figures, this was really a kind of science of history, how history inevitably must unfold. It must necessarily unfold from this superstition, supernaturalism, to us, in essence, naturalists. So ironically then, the laws of nature came to be thought of as opposed to a theological understanding of the world, whereas initially, historically, they were nothing but that. And finally then, scientific naturalism, ironically, derives its intelligibility from its resting on a covert theology. Let me stop there. Except to say one thing, the full version is in that book, where you also get the story about what happens to belief as well. So it's in all good bookstores, I believe.
Well, we have a very large... I'm sorry, Shawnee? Okay. We have a very large number of questions. We'll get to at least a few of them, and many of them have to do with what are the implications of this development for various kinds of contemporary issues. But let's try to begin with a couple that are more historical. Let me try this one. So, how does God, as efficient cause of all, and therefore everything being miraculous, differ from Augustine's idea of nature as a miracle? Is it that Augustine would not describe nature's regular motions as subject to laws? How then would he explain the regular motion of the stars, for example?
Yeah, so look, that's a good question. So we need to be clear here that the fact that the 17th century sees this innovative conception of laws of nature, it doesn't follow from that prior to that, no one has any conception that nature is, its operations are regular. They absolutely do. But the regularity comes from typically the intrinsic properties of things. So certainly in the Aristotelian understanding of how things work. So the difference is not, we have an intelligible regularity in the natural world only from the 17th century on. No, but it's how we understand that regularity, and the innovation of the 17th century laws of nature conception is that regularity comes from God directly imposing his will on matter that is essentially inert. So the key thing is that, and Boyle says this explicitly, it's not from things intrinsic to matter, it's extrinsic, okay? Whereas in the Aristotelian world, that was the standard view, more or less through the Middle Ages, we could qualify that, but things have internal properties and powers of their own. In a Christianised version, God implanted them, but they're intrinsic to things, okay? And that's why the heavenly bodies move according to their intrinsic properties. Things on Earth move according to their intrinsic properties. So laws of nature gives us a completely different picture of how the regularities work. And more than that, these regularities are immutable and universal because, as Descartes puts it, they derive those qualities from their divine origin. Okay, whereas for Aristotle, natural order was what happens for the most part, which is a slightly different understanding of how regularity operated.
Good. Well, thank you. So what is the relationship between naturalism and materialism? Could naturalists believe in non-material but nevertheless natural laws, for example, a karma or something like that?
Yeah. That's a good question. I've realised I left out part of the answer to the previous question about Augustine and the miraculous. And just to say here, Augustine had a very interesting conception of that's called seminal reasons, that God had implanted the potential for things to develop in particular ways. But that was a Stoic version that was later overtaken by Aristotelianism. But anyway, that's by the by. Now, sorry, coming back to this question, which is the naturalism and look, this is a great question. The link between naturalism and materialism, and I think certainly if we look at the contemporary situation. Someone like David Papineau will say that naturalism to some extent commits you to something like physicalism, which is if you deny that there are spiritual entities, then that suggests that there's no spiritual realm, there's only a material realm. So there is a connection there. But the second part of the question, which I think is really interesting, which was Can you be a naturalist and yet believe there is something like karma? And I don't think naturalism entails logically. I don't think naturalism logically entails materialism. Okay, so you could, for example, be an idealist and still be a naturalist. I think. You could believe that the whole realm was entirely spiritual and not material, and still think that was a natural phenomenon. Okay, although interestingly, that would be an unusual position to take, I think. But to give you an example, in the early 20th century, there's a lot of interest in empirical studies of psychic phenomena. Okay, but the assumption was that there would always be a naturalistic explanation for this stuff. So you find people believing in telekinesis and psychic communication, but believing that all of that could be understood in purely naturalistic terms. So the short answer to that question is that I don't think naturalism necessarily entails materialism, but I think in fact they often go together.
That actually maybe brings us to both an historical and a theological question. The diabolical was an area of experience and phenomena and reflection which was very actively pursued in this same period where the supernatural natural distinction comes up. Where does it fit in there? How does it relate to that question?
Yeah. So again, it's a good point. So that so historically, what's interesting is that the operation of the diabolical non-natural forces actually seems to peak in the early modern period. It's not actually in the middle. It's, of course, it's there in the Middle Ages, and what this calls for is certainly, particularly on the part of the Catholic Church, a significant interest in determining in developing criteria for determining what sorts of events were genuinely natural, what were genuinely supernatural, and what were diabolical, as it were. And this led to something that I left out of the story. Is there's a kind of middle category called the preternatural, which is the use by angels and devils of various. So how did demons perform their work? Well, they did it because they knew how nature operated better than we did, right? And that kind of activity was called preternatural. And it was important that the Catholic Church develop forensic procedures for making these determinations, because miracle working could be either divinely inspired or it could be diabolical. And not only that, we have the developing criteria for canonization, which canonization requires the performance of miracles, so you need forensic procedures that enable you to make these determinations. So you have a much, cutting a long story short, maybe not short enough, but anyway, what you see during this period that formalises the natural supernatural distinction is a set of, as I say, a set of procedures that enable you to make determinations about what category these things fall into. And as I say, you do have this middle category called the preternatural at this time.
Moving perhaps in a more contemporary direction, here is this question. Is not methodological naturalism necessary, at the very least, as an epistemic stance in order to gain any traction in many disciplines? So presumably you would not want to be operated on by a pre-modern or postmodern, for that matter, doctor. And so on. So without methodological naturalism, the computer you used for your presentation and the plane you flew on would not be possible, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a good question. So I think first of all, if you think of my last point, is that there is actually no genuine pure naturalism, because naturalism actually assumes a theological foundation insofar as it, on my account, that the intelligibility of the world and the lawfulness of the operations actually assumes a kind of theological, unspoken theological premise. But look, I think the practical question is really interesting. I mean, could you get a science up and running, without the presumption of methodological naturalism? And only a few brave souls have dared to suggest you could. Alvin Plantinga, the analytic philosopher, has suggested you could, right? I think sociologically you couldn't, right? And so one answer to the question is, could you do this? You couldn't sociologically, because the community of scientists at the moment is premised on the assumption that science proceeds on the assumption with methodological naturalism, okay? Plantinga's argument is, well, if you're a Christian scientist, why wouldn't you admit all the possible causes, which would include God? So that doesn't seem unreasonable, but it's not practical, okay? Now, to the point about the computer and the plane, et cetera, there's so one of the arguments for naturalism is that science predicated on naturalism gives us technology, and it gives us predictability, and it gives us all this stuff, right? Now, and it follows from that then, if science is predicated on naturalistic assumptions and science gives us all of this, aren't the naturalistic assumptions of science therefore vindicated by the outcomes of the scientific investigation? So there's two answers to that, I think, and one is that naturalism has theological commitments that are tacit. Okay, that's one answer. The other is the success of science tells us nothing about the reality of the theoretical entities that it postulates, right? Now, what I mean by that is that the sciences have always been successful. Newtonian science was successful. The Ptolemaic view was successful. Galenic medicine was successful, right? All in, we say in their own ways, but they give you predictability, you know. These 19th century guys who invented the radio, they thought there was ether out there that the radio waves were going through, for Pete's sake, right? So you get technology, you get predictability from all kinds of sciences, right? But the predictability doesn't tell you whether what the science is postulating is true. And we know this as historians. The scientists don't often know this, right? But the historians know this because they look at the past and they see how one successful science is replaced by another. Newtonian science is replaced by Einsteinian science. Einsteinian views of reality are not fine-tuning Newtonian science. They're telling us something completely different, right? Quantum mechanics, that's just completely incompatible with any understanding of 19th century physics, right? And yet 19th century physics was terrific. It gave us all sorts of stuff. So the second answer to that question is, let's not conflate the success of science and its capacity to predict stuff with the ultimate truth of the ontological claims that it makes. Now, that's a kind of subtle position that a lot of scientists don't accept, and there are philosophers of science who don't accept. But a lot of historians buy it because they look at the history of science and see that all of the sciences throughout history have worked at some level, and that's why they were accepted by people. They gave you predictability. Okay, so I could talk about that topic for a long time, but I won't.
Let's go into another really important contemporary issue. The historical development that you laid out here, according to this question, seems to me that this can shed light on the controversy about free will and the radical dependence of the mind or activity of the brain. How might a more accurate intellectual history of naturalism help us to dissolve the false contradiction between freedom and embodiment?
Wow, that's a big question, and I really can't do this justice at all. I mean, so it does relate to. I mean, it does relate to there's a previous question about naturalism and materialism, right? And I think that naturalists are very often committed to the notion that the mind is nothing but the brain, and that if the mind is nothing but the brain and the brain is material stuff and it's subject to the laws of nature, how is free will possible given that understanding? And that makes perfect sense, I think. I'm not sure that you need to have a kind of Cartesian ontology, which is, say, a Cartesian stuff that says the mind is made of spiritual stuff and the brain is, I don't think you need that. Where am I going with all this? Look, I don't think materialistic science is going to solve the problem of consciousness. Let's put it that way. So just to lay my cards on the table, I believe in what's called the hard problem of consciousness, which is to say how we get thoughts and qualia and feelings from the grey matter of the brain. I don't think is a problem you can solve just by studying the brain, and lots of people would disagree with that, including people around here. You know, Dan Dennett famously at Tufts, you know, just didn't think there was a problem at all. There is a problem, Dan, you know, and I don't think science will solve it. But I'll stop there.
Let's make this the final question. One way of looking at this distinction would be to say that the natural is the ordinary mode of God's action in the world, and the supernatural is the extraordinary mode of God's action in the world. How does that map onto the development that you talk about? Is that actually what Aquinas proposed?
No, look, I don't think that's what Aquinas proposed, but I do think it's what Augustine proposed. Okay, and because what Augustine wanted to suggest is that there's no ontological difference between the natural and the miraculous and the non-miraculous, right? It's a subjective distinction that's a function of we're surprised by something and we call it miraculous. But Aquinas has a distinct ontology of the miraculous and the non-miraculous, and then in the early modern period, you get everything you get something more like an Augustinian kind of position that everything is miraculous. Now, there's something more I wanted to say on that.
The natural is the ordinary mode of God's action in the world, and the supernatural is the extraordinary mode.
Yeah. You could say that if it's a kind of simple modal distinction, but the question is whether that's a distinction that is understood purely in terms of our perception, or whether there's some genuine ontological difference between the operation. And that's really, I'm just rehearsing what I said back in relation to Augustine. But there is in Protestantism a similar kind of distinction that talks about general and special providence. Okay, and God's general providence is the upholding of the laws of nature, but his special providence is personal, and it's something, it's our experience of God, working in our lives. That would be one way of understanding it, which does, so it's something different from the regular operations of nature, as it were, because it does seem to be something that's quite specific to us. So you do get that distinction there, and, at some level it makes sense, I think. Yeah. Let me stop there.
Good. Well, thank you. I just want to say a quick word before we give a round of applause and thanks to our speaker. In the coming weeks, we have a whole range of offerings starting up, so please pick up one of the brochures on the red table on the way out, or check out harvardcatholicforum.org to register. Courses and reading groups begin in the next couple of weeks on Dante's Purgatorio, Catholic Bioethics, Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, Catholic Social Teaching, Joseph Pieper's classic Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And there will be several exciting lectures and sacred music programs later in the semester. And again, please help us by filling out the 2-minute survey and dropping it in the box as you leave. Or for our Zoom viewers, doing the quick survey you will get shortly. And everyone here in the hall, please join us now for some food and drink and fellowship. And thank you, Peter Harrison.